Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our class. We're going to cover chapter 2. This is the chemical level of organization. All right, this is the list of the content that we're going to cover today. Now, I want you to think that the way how I teach the class and the way how I want you to try to approach to this class is to keep in mind what things you can use in daily basis, what things you can use in the real life situations. And in that case, there are things like, of course, like atoms that is part of the content that you need to cover, but honestly, you will never see this in practice. However, with this first portion, the elements, I want you to pay special attention with that because as we're going to see here, there are elements that are crucial for the human body. And then the other part that I said, pay a lot of attention or invest time understanding and is the part of the inorganic compounds, primarily the pH. What is the pH? What is this a scale for? When we decide that something is acid, base, because in practice we do blood tests, urine tests, and several other tests all the time, and you will see this pH, a pH value all the time. So this is crucial for you to understand what is the pH and what does that mean. Also with the organic compounds, this is something else, of course. We don't cover all the organic compounds, but these ones are the most important ones. We mentioned this in the previous chapter, especially carbohydrates and lipids, which are things that we eat that we need to have in our diet. Carbohydrates are sugars, lipids are fats. Those are the main organic compounds that our body uses to get energy, right, as a fuel uh, uh, source. And proteins are things that we need to ingest because those are the things that will our body will use to create structures, right? Proteins. And then we're going to cover nucleotides at the very end. But just what I'm saying is these two blocks of informations are the ones that are the most relevant and important, and then the rest is not that it's not important, but are things that they will have less applications, maybe except the isotopes, which you will see how interesting are the isotopes, especially when we think about cancer. Okay, so let's get started. What is the concept of an element? Many of you probably have an idea what an element is, and we're not going to stick to the fancy concept, okay, which it says that is, a pure substance that is distinguished from all other matters by the fact that it cannot be created or broken down by ordinary chemical means. Let's just say that elements are things that are the most small impure substances that there are in our environment. And the elements are present in things that are alive and things that are not alive. Now, what we need to take care of learning here is the elements that are important for the human body, elements that are crucial to keep you healthy. There are several elements that when we have a lack of them, or if we have an excessive amount of them, they can significantly impact the human health. Or some of them, it can, if you have a super low or high concentration of some of them, they can cause severe damage, even sometimes they can lead to death. So one of them that I want to just kind of briefly mention is calcium. Probably you heard about calcium and in typical normal conversations. The calcium is something that is good for your bones, that, if you have a good bones, you need calcium. But it's not just calcium. And it's not just bones. Calcium is very important for other reasons. And it's so important that even though it's just an element, your body has two glands that are dedicated to maintain the normal range of, or the normal value of calcium. The normal range of calcium in blood should be between 8 and 10. You don't need to know these numbers, so don't worry about it. But what I'm saying is that when your calcium levels in blood drop less than 8 or they're more than 10, your body will try to do whatever the body can do to bring those calcium levels back up. Calcium is a very important element. not just for the bones, like I said before, but also for things like nerve transmissions, the way how the nerves can send electrical impulses to communicate with other cells, or for muscle contraction. If you have too few calcium, for example, in your blood, that can lead to seizures or cramps, muscle spasms. And if you have too much of calcium in your blood in the long term, that can lead to, for example, kidney stones, right? Or the calcium accumulates in your arteries, etc. Those are just examples of how one single element can impact possibly or positively or negatively in your health. And that's what we're going to do now, is to learn what are the most important ones for the human body. In this slide, I have what we know as the periodic table, the anatomic properties of the elements in the periodic table. Probably you're familiar with this. Do you need to know all the details about this periodic table? No. But again, all the elements that I'm going to be mentioned, at least 10 important elements, I want you to get comfortable and know where's the location of these elements, what is the symbol for those elements, and I'm going to talk about those, how you, when you see a periodic table, what does the numbers that you see in the periodic table, what is the meaning of that? We're going to talk about atoms and an atomic weight, etc. So pretty common uh, thing to know is where are those elements that are important for the human body. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. This slide is important. Notice here that we have the 4 most abundant elements in the human body. And those 4, in order of, the one that we have in greater proportion, is oxygen, followed by carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. It's so that, if you add or you sum all these 4 elements together, they make about 96% of the all elements that decompose the human body. Now, remember that sometimes elements, they're not just isolated, or meaning they're not just alone. For example, you probably might think, if somebody asks about one of the most abundant substance in the human body, some of you might say water, right? And you're correct. But water is H2O. So really what you have there is one element of oxygen, and to that oxygen you have 2 hydrogen atoms that are uh, connected, if you will, or they are bound to the oxygen. But you can see there that a molecule of water, or a compound of water, contains oxygen and also contains hydrogen. So, and those are very common elements. So for now, at this point, know that the 4 most abundant elements of the human body are these 4, and that overall the most abundant is oxygen. What else? Let's look at this table that we have here, the table of these elements. For your exams, and it's important to recognize the symbol of some elements. For example, oxygen, the symbol for oxygen is just an O, so that's pretty easy. Carbon is a C, hydrogen is an H, and you can apply most of that for the majority of the elements, but there are some of them that you have to be careful, and I'm going to show you that. Like potassium is very important for the human body, and sometimes you may think potassium, the symbol might be P, but instead the symbol for potassium is K. Okay, so P is phosphorus, don't worry too much about it, but the symbol for potassium is K. The same thing for sodium, which is another very important element. The symbol for sodium is actually Na. And calcium, you might think calcium C, but remember the C is carbon, so calcium is Ca. So just be careful, memorizing these symbols. And again, these ones are elements that are extremely important. Okay, oxygen, just to give you a little bit of information here, oxygen is what we need in order for us to produce energy in an efficient way. And when I said us, I'm referring to our organs. But in more detail, to be more specific, really, what your organs are composed by tissues, and those tissues contain cells. So when we say that we need to breathe to get oxygen, really it's our cells the ones that need that oxygen to make energy. So we're going to learn in the next chapter, chapter 3, everything about the cell. But just to give you kind of an anticipation of that, the cells need to produce something called ATP, which ATP is a molecule that is going to be used for the cells to generate energy and to be able to do things. Without energy, the cells are not going to be able to survive and they will die. So your tissues need oxygen, yes or yes. And see, oxygen then is required to produce ATP. That's why we need to breathe. Um, what else in the talking about elements and the importance of those and the practice? Let's look at calcium. Calcium is something that if you many of you might relate calcium with health, with bone health, right? And or saying, well, the bones has calcium, and that's why the bones are hard, and that's why they can support the body and resist and serve as a protection for the organs, and that's correct. You know, a healthy bone is a bone that has bone matrix, which is it has to have calcium, right? So if you're lacking of calcium in your bones might become fragile and brittle, and it can fracture, and the bones will definitely lose the ability to protect your internal organs. Just think about the ribs, right? The ribs are these bones around the thoracic cavity that the main function is to protect the organs are in the chest. Or think about the skull, which is the one organ that protects your brain. So calcium is important for that, so for bone, but there are other functions associated with calcium, like nerve transmission or impulses, right? So we need the cells, the neurons that send your electrical impulses, they require calcium in order to be able to generate action potential and in order to release neurotransmitters. Without enough calcium in your blood, the nerve transmission will be impaired. Another examples are muscle contraction also requires calcium, as we're going to learn later in the course, and coagulation, blood clotting. When you cut yourself and you're bleeding, the way how your body needs to respond to that is by stopping the bleeding by making a blood clot. Calcium is an extremely important element to create or to maintain a coagulation system that will make a blood clot when is required. That is calcium, right? Sodium, potassium, they play a role important in action potential, but I'm going to mention those later. At this point, I'm not going to talk about them a lot. Other elements that are important that are relevant. For example, iron. See, the symbol for iron is Fe, and iron, if you don't know, iron is something that most of the time people, when somebody says has this patient has low iron levels, what comes to your mind that that person might have? All right, if you said anemia, that is correct. Why? Because you know your red blood cells, which are the cells that we have in our blood, I'll put RBC for red blood cells. Those are the cells that we have in the blood, and the main function of those cells is to transport oxygen, to deliver that oxygen to your tissues, because of the reason that I mentioned before here. Your cells, your tissues, they need oxygen to generate energy, ATP. So we breathe oxygen. Air with oxygen enters the lungs, and then there is a gas exchange in the alveoli of the lung, and oxygen passes from the lung into the blood. And specifically, are the red blood cells the ones that carry the oxygen to deliver that to the tissues. So the reason why iron is important for that is because there is a molecule, very tiny, microscopic, it's a protein that is in the red blood cells. This protein is called hemoglobin. This hemoglobin is a protein that contains 4 iron uh, elements, and each molecule of hemoglobin is able to carry 4 oxygen atoms because within the hemoglobin the oxygen attaches to the iron. So that's why iron is important for hemoglobin, because without the iron the hemoglobin will not be able to connect or bind to the oxygen, and the red blood cells will not be able to transport the oxygen to the tissues. So when you have iron deficiency, what you develop is something called anemia. Okay, and you have less hemoglobin, the red blood cells, you produce less red blood cells also because, and the red blood cells are more small because you're not creating enough hemoglobin because of the lack of iron. And I just mentioned before that iron is this element where oxygen will attach to the hemoglobin, and that way the red blood cells are going to be able to transport that oxygen to the tissues. All right, what else? Here we have iodine. The symbol for iodine is an I. And this, I'm just going to mention this briefly. Iodine in practice is important for thyroid. You know, thyroid gland is a gland that we have in the neck, and it's a gland that produces thyroid hormones, which are the major hormones that are involved in the control of the metabolic rate, metabolism. There's a very common condition called hypothyroidism, in which you have low thyroid hormones. The point that I want to make here is that iodine is another crucial element that will form the thyroid hormones. Without iodine, your thyroid gland will not be able to produce thyroid hormones. And the only way how you get the iodine is through the diet. There are other ones that I can, keep going, but I think at this point, um, this specific part makes the point of the importance of the elements in the human body, and there are specific elements that needs to be regulated, and your body needs to have enough quantities to maintain health and homeostasis. As I mentioned before, rarely in nature you're going to find the elements isolated. Most of the time, the elements will be bind or they will join with other elements, forming what we know as chemical bonds. That's what we know as a compound. So a compound is a substance composed by 2 or more elements joined by the chemical bond. We have, as a broad category, inorganic compounds and organic compounds. Now, I'm just going to tell you this really quick. What's the difference between an organic and inorganic compound? Well, you have to have 2 things, or a chemical has to have 2 things to become or to be considered as a organic compound. It must have carbon and it must have hydrogen. So if we look at this picture, I'm showing you here, you don't have to memorize anything about this. I'm showing you the typical chemical structure of an amino acid. An amino acid is a substance that when you put many amino acids together, they will form proteins. So amino acids are known as the building blocks of proteins. And if you look at the structure here, the symbol for carbon is C. So we have a carbon and we have a hydrogen. That is an example of an organic compound because the presence of carbon and hydrogen, both of them, they must be present in the chemical structure. If you have, for example, water, see, when we ask, is a water organic or inorganic? Many students will, by instinct, say it's organic because it sounds like, water is important for life. We need that. It must be organic. But recall that, what I just said before, a chemical is organic if it contains both. And if you look at the structure of water, which contains one element of oxygen and two hydrogens, we are missing the carbon. And that's why the water is inorganic compound. Now that we have a basic understanding about the elements and which ones are important for the human body, let's review the difference between an element and atom, and then we're going to dive in details about the atoms, subatomic particles, and all of these next. Now let's talk about atoms. So atom versus an element. What is the difference between an atom and an element? Because we have, if we use sodium, for example, we have sodium atom and we have also sodium, the element. So which one is which? So if we read the concept, an atom is the smallest quantity of an element that retains the unique properties of that element. So what that means is that what is the smallest quantity of something? The smallest quantity of something is 1, right? So during class, I like to use this analogy just to describe the difference between an atom and element, using sand as an example. So if you go to the beach and grab a bucket full of sand, you have a bunch of sand that will be the equivalent to an element. And if you take from that bucket of sand a single grain of sand, that is an atom. If that is not clear enough, let's do this in the screen. Let's say that each of these circles that I'm drawing here, I'm gonna make 6. Each of them represent an atom of sodium, but all these 6 atoms, they are the element sodium. Okay, so this element sodium contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 atoms. So that's what that means. The smallest quantity of something is 1, and that is an atom, right? The next thing that we're going to see now is talk about in detail about atoms and how they interact with other atoms. First, you need to know that the atoms are divided or have subparts. Those are the ones that we call subatomic particles. And if we look at this picture, there are 2 pictures that they show a model. And pay attention, this is a model because these illustrations do not represent how the atoms actually are. Until this point, atoms are extremely tiny that we cannot actually see them. Even using, the most potent and sophisticated microscope, we have never seen how an atom actually looks like. So these models, what they represent or what they illustrate is the way how scientists believe that atoms are composed and how they behave, and they explain how they interact with each other. So what we need to think is that we have in an atom something we call a nucleus. In this electron cloud model, we can see here the nucleus. And in this one, in the planetary model, we have this nucleus as well. So going back to the subatomic particles, all the atoms has 3 parts, has protons, neutrons, and electrons. And the name of these subatomic particles has to do with the electrical charge. So for example, a neutron has no charge, it's neutral, the charge is neutral. An electron has a negative charge. And a proton, just think about proton, P, start with positive, has a positive charge. So if we look at this model here, right, we can see that in the planetary model we have the nucleus, He stands for helium, and then helium, within the nucleus you have protons and neutrons, and see that these electrons, which are negatively charged, that's why we have the negative symbol here, they're kind of orbiting the the nucleus of this atom. That's why this model is called the planetary model. So they kind of go around the nucleus. Now the other model, it shows you here better, and that's why I have the letter protons and kind of in a red color to show you that this is what these represent. Okay, so protons, they have a positive charge, and neutrons in yellow, they have a neutral charge. That's why you don't see it. Both together, protons plus neutrons, is what form the nucleus of the atom. And then somewhere here surrounding the nucleus is where we have electrons, okay, which has a negative charge. A little bit more about the protons, things that we already mentioned, positively charged. And this is going to be very important, that protons give mass to the atom. So just keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to, when we look at the periodic table and look at the elements, this mass is going to be important to determine the atomic weight or atomic mass. So just keep in mind that concept. And also these 3 points are extremely important to know. Protons in the atom, positive charge. Number 2, give mass to the atom. And number 3, the number of protons determines the element. This is important. So I'm going to show you using this little portion of the periodic table. When you look in the superior corner of the periodic table, you're going to see a number. In this case, helium 2, neon 10, oxygen 8, nitrogen 7, right? So what this number tells you is that the element or the atom of nitrogen, for example, contains 7 protons in its nucleus. Or helium. Helium has 2 protons, and none other element has 2 protons. So helium is helium because it contains 2 protons in the nucleus. Carbon is carbon because it contains 6 protons in the nucleus. So what that means is that if you have and this might require a little bit of imagination, okay? But what that means is that if you have an atom of carbon which contains 6 protons, and you have a way to put or to add another proton in the nucleus of a carbon, if you have that power and the ability to do it, once this extra proton joins the nucleus, carbon will transform to nitrogen. Isn't that crazy? Sound like strange, right? So even though you have an atom of carbon, if you add a proton to a nucleus, the nucleus will not have 6, will have 7, and now the atom will transform to nitrogen and will have all the nitrogen properties. If you an atom of nitrogen add a proton to the nucleus, that will transform to oxygen. And of course, when I'm saying to add it, that requires an immense amount of energy and power to do that. So that is something just to keep in mind, or just something interesting to know. The basic concept here is that the number in the periodic table in the superior corner represent how many protons an element has in its nucleus. Okay. 3 important points with the neutrons, which is the other one. Well, we already mentioned neutrons. They have no charge, not electrical charge. Uh, Neutrons also give mass to the atoms. And remember that neutrons plus protons, what makes your nucleus, the nucleus of an atom. And then the other thing is that we just mentioned that the amount of protons in the nucleus is what dictate what element or what atom is the one that you have. And we just said, for example, carbon is carbon because you have 6. Now, with neutrons, you can have the same amount of protons, but also you can have a different amount of neutrons in an atom, and the atom will still be the atom. This is what we call isotopes. So to illustrate that, let's just look at this picture. So this is a representation of the atom hydrogen and the planetary model. So you can see here, this is the nucleus. And I add a P here in each one to illustrate that the P represent proton. Okay, so in the three of them, we have only one P, and that's why this element is still hydrogen, because it contains only one proton. Now, the other circles represent the neutrons. So if you see this one in the middle, you have your proton plus a neutron. So this is still a hydrogen and it's an isotope. You have a different version of hydrogen in which you have the proton, but see, you have here one, two neutrons. And this, even though you have two neutrons, this is still hydrogen because the amount of protons, but now this hydrogen is an isotope because it has a different amount of neutrons in the nucleus. And this one, for example, here, as you can see here, there's not even a neutron there in the nucleus. It's just the proton, right? If you see these blue circles, they represent the electrons, right? But the important point here is that an atom can have different amounts of neutrons. And those, in this case, they are called isotopes. This is something that we're going to cover now in detail, and it's important because it has a relevance in medical and nuclear medicine, where you can see and have tests that will use isotopes. The last subatomic particle is the electron, or electrons. So first, the electrons, remember, has a negative charge, and that's going to be important. They're extremely tiny. I told you before that the neutrons and protons are the ones that give mass to the atom, or weight to the atom. Electrons do not give mass to the atom. See that you need at least 2,000 electrons to equal the mass of one proton. So that means that it's extremely tiny and light. So there's not an element that has 2,000 electrons. So in that case, the weight of an atom is in the nucleus of the atom. Now, the electrons in general, they will match the amount of protons that an atom will have. So for example, if you look at this picture, we have neon here. We know that neon has two protons, and that's why neon has number 2. So it has two protons. And if you count the electrons, 1, 2. Right? So in general, carbon, was the atomic number for carbon? 6. That tells us that carbon has 6 protons. And how many electrons, which are represented with this blue outside of the nucleus, those blue circles? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Most of the time, atoms will have the same amount of electrons than protons, but there are situations where that will not be the case, as we're going to learn. And then what will be the importance of the electrons? We will see that the importance is that, as I mentioned before, in nature, atoms rarely are isolated, or rarely you're going to find them just separated. Most of the time, you will find elements that are attached to other, or atoms that are attached to other atoms, forming compounds or molecules, and that is related to the interaction between the electrons. But we're going to cover that in detail in just in a minute. The concept of atomic number and atomic mass, or mass, number, atomic weight, is kind of the same thing. Okay, atomic number is simple. It's that little number that I mentioned before, you can see in the periodic table of each atom that is in the superior corner, right? And that number represents how many protons that atom will have. We already mentioned that. Now, atomic weight, you can find that right below the name of the atom. For example, we can see carbon, that mass or atomic weight is 12. So important here is, when you read the concept, mass number is the sum of the number of protons plus the neutrons. So in this case, we can say that because we know the carbon, the atomic number is 12, and if we just read the concept, we know that the carbon has 6 protons. That means that carbon, how many neutrons will have? 6, right? Because 6 plus 6 equals 12, and that is the atomic mass. You can compare, or you can do the same thing for the other ones. See this boron, the atomic number is 5, and the atomic mass is 10, so that means that 5 protons, 5 neutrons. Um, you do the same thing with nitrogen and oxygen. You can do, all of these. Now, because again, in general, elements or atoms, then the same number of protons in the nucleus will be equal to the same number of neutrons in the nucleus. However, there's certain situations like this. We have, for example, here uranium. So uranium, if you see the number, the atomic number is 92. And then what will be the atomic mass? Well, you see here 238. But if you do the same math that you've been doing with our other ones, 92 protons plus 92 neutrons, that will give you a different number. That will be 184, right? So that doesn't match with this atomic mass. So what does that mean? That means that this element or this atom has a different amount of neutrons than in the nucleus than the others. So how we can calculate how many? So just based on the mass is 238, and if we know for sure that uranium has 92 protons, we just do the calculation here by subtracting uh, 92 from those 238, and that will be how much? Let me do the math here, 146, right? So 6, 8, yes. So see, this uranium has 146 neutrons. And, the regular uranium should be this, that has the equal amount, but because this uranium has more, it's what we call an isotope. It's still uranium, it's a heavier element, because just see, compare the atomic mass 238 versus 184. So that explain what we just mentioned about isotopes, and now we're going to see and talk about isotopes and how this is relevant in nuclear medicine. Before we do that, actually, let's just look at the at least 10 important elements for the human body, the ones that we mentioned initially, and the table when we just start the class. One of them, let's just find where are those 4 most important elements, and the most abundant overall is oxygen. So oxygen is over here, atomic number is 8, carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen is the very first one, okay? So there are the 4 most abundant elements in the human body. Other ones that we mentioned were sodium, which is located here, atomic number 11, 11 protons, potassium, 19 protons, calcium, 20, iron, 26, iodine, 53. So how many we have here? So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's pick another one. Magnesium is important. Magnesium is an element that sometimes you can buy it over the counter, and there's several types of magnesium. Some of them might be used for people who have constipation, and it helps to improve constipation. Other people with insomnia or difficulty concentrating, people with anxiety. There are several types of magnesium you can take and has some functions associated. All right, and then what else? We have, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There may be a little bit more, but those by far are the most important ones that you at least need to know, and just maybe just see and be able to identify them in the periodic table. All right, going back to the isotopes and specifically the neutrons, right? We know the neutrons, we know the atoms can have different amount of neutrons and there will still be an atom. Previously I mentioned hydrogen, I took that as an example. And if we now know what is the atomic mass, what these isotopes, what that tells you, at least right now, is that the more neutrons you have in the nucleus, of course, the heavier the isotope, the heavier the atom will be. So if all these three are versions of hydrogen, which one is going to be the heaviest of the three? The one that has two neutrons in the nucleus, because if you just do the math to calculate the atomic mass, you just need to do the sum of all the protons plus the neutrons. So one proton plus two neutrons, the atomic mass for that isotope is 3. If you do the same thing, but with this one, with this version of hydrogen, this is a little bit lighter because the atomic mass will be 2, and this one is even more lighter because the atomic mass is 1. Those are isotopes. All right, so I just mentioned how we can apply this for medical purposes. Let's just think about this first. When you have an isotopes, they tend to be unstable, okay? And unstable isotopes are radioactive. They're sometimes are called radioisotopes because they generate energy called radiation energy. And as you know, depending on the amount of radiation can affect the human cells. If it's a large amount of radiation, it can be fatal. If it's a large amount, can cause mutations in the DNA that can lead to cancer, right? Or if it's in the correct amount, this radiation can be used in medicine. And I have two here, right? Radioembolization. I'm going to just talk about this very briefly. It's something that sometimes we use to shrink or to kill cancer cells. The way how they work is like this. Imagine that when somebody has a tumor or a cancer, is when you have many cells growing without any restriction. So the cells are just growing like crazy, right? And there's no control. That's what a cancer is. Now, keep in mind that every single cell in your body, even the cancer cells, they need what? Blood supply. So, blood supply, because a cancer cell, it needs sugar, it needs glucose, it needs oxygen in order for these cells to make energy and to keep replicating. So, radioembolization is a procedure in which um, through a needle, right, we can inject a substance that is an isotope. And I told you before that if you have enough quantity of radiation, that can cause damage. So basically, what that means is that when you inject um, this chemical, this what is called radioembolization, what it's going to do is that it's going to cause damage to the blood vessel that supply blood to the tumor, and then the tumor will run out of blood supply and it will destroy the cell. That is what radioembolization is. And the other which is, in my opinion, is more interesting and more common to see in the doctor's office or in the emergency or hospital, is a PET scan. Okay, PET scan stands for positron emission tomography scan. Okay, that's the PET scan, and this is a picture of one of them. I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna make this picture a little bit bigger. I'm gonna talk about that, how the test is done, how that works. Right. So the thing is that this PET scan is a test that we do to be able to visualize which organs or tissues are using energy. Right. Remember that a cancer, right, a tumor, a cancer cells are cells that are replicating, are multiplying a lot. And when they do that, that means that they're requiring a lot of nutrients, sugar, to be able to generate the energy that requires cellular division, multiplying in cells. So the way how you do is that first the patient will take glucose orally. This is a sugar, but this is not the regular sugar. The type of sugar that they're drinking is an isotope. So this isotope of sugar, they will drink that. The sugar will go from their intestine, right? From mouth, esophagus, stomach, intestine, then will get absorbed. And then when it gets absorbed, then this sugar enters the bloodstream. And then once they enter the bloodstream, then it's available for the tissues. So the tissues can use that sugar. Now remember that isotopes, they're radioactive. They produce radiation. And what this machine does is that it's able to capture that radiation that the glucose is producing. So let's look at the picture. So the patient took the glucose, and we have in this side, this is like a tomography, right? If you can see here, this is where the lungs are located, right? This is where the heart is going to be located. This is the chest, this is the abdomen, this is the liver, right? And of course, you can see here, there's the neck and the head, blah, blah, blah. All this white stuff is bone. So we cannot see anything here, right? Now, once you put the machine that will capture and detect the radiation that comes from the glucose, then you can see it how this look like. So I told you that this is the heart, so it makes sense because the heart is the pump of the body and is always in constantly pumping blood. It makes sense that you will see this light. It makes sense that the heart is picking up this glucose to generate energy, to generate muscle contraction. But also, if you pay attention here at the neck, you see here you have this little nodule, something in the neck that is kind of suspicious, because why this specific part of the neck is taking all this sugar to do what with it? So, right, that's very suspicious. See an isolated nodule here that's picking up that sugar. If you look at this picture below here, also this is the brain, by the way, so you can see here there's the head, is where the nose will be, right? So see that the brain is picking all that sugar, but that makes sense, right? Because the brain is you're constantly thinking and doing stuff, so it makes sense that you take energy. The same thing with the heart. But what about this nodule? That is very suspicious, okay? And if you look at this picture that's even bigger there, you can see the brain, that is normal, the heart is normal, you see the nodule here, and also look at this one here, okay? So this is a male, of course, you can see here clearly that is a male. So most likely what this patient has probably, and this is with the pelvis, so this is where probably the prostate gland is located. And see how the prostate gland is picking up all this glucose. Maybe this patient has a prostate cancer, and maybe this is a metastasis of that cancer. Who knows, right? But that is the point. That is the point I want to make. This isotope, this PET scan, is a test that is done in patients who has cancer. So if somebody is having a PET scan, you know that there's a patient that has cancer, and they're looking for areas in the body that will shine when they do the test, and to look for tissues or metastases or tumors that otherwise will be hard to visualize without this test. Let's review the electrons in more detail, and specifically electrons behavior, how they affect the ability of an atom to attach or to connect or to enter to chemical reactions to other elements or atoms because of the electrons. There are two major concepts that we need to understand to and that we're going to see here to see how these electrons behave and how atoms interact with others. First, we need to know the concept electron shell and also valence shell. Now, remember that atoms, they will have different amount of electrons, and most of the time, we said, the amount of electrons will equal the amount of protons of an atom. So we have here hydrogen, for in general, hydrogen will have 1 electron. Neon has 2 protons, in general 2 electrons. Carbon 6, and I'm sorry, I think I say neon, that's helium. And then neon will have how many? 10. So that is the amount of electrons. Now, if you pay attention closely to each one, and especially this is more evident, or you can see that better when you have an atom that has more electrons, notice that their electrons are closer to the nucleus, and there are other electrons that are more far away, right? They are farther away from the nucleus. Those electrons that are here at this level, they're orbiting the nucleus in a closer point. That's what we call electron shells. This other group that are more far away from the nucleus, this is another electron shell or energy level. So let's review that in detail now. First, we need to understand that depending on the atom you're looking at, you will have several types or several energy levels depending on the amount of electrons that that atom will have. Now, there's a quick rule here that you need to remember. So first is that, and we're following the planetary model, right? So we have this chlorine atom that this green represents the nucleus, right? So all this has a positive charge. There are neutrons and electrons and protons over there. All the blue ones are the electrons. Now, the energy level, which we know that is an electron shell, so it's a layer of electrons that encircle the nucleus at distinct energy level, is this one. This is the first energy level. Notice the concept that I want you to know is that this one can only hold 2 electrons. If the atom has more electrons, so those other electrons must be in a different energy level. In this case, with this specific atom, this will be the second energy level or the second electron shell. And then after that, we have a third level, energy level or electron shell. This second energy level, and for the rest, basically, the amount of electrons that you can have there is 8. So, and then when you have 8, that electron shell is full. So we can account, if you want, in this second energy level. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That means that this second electron shell is full. If the atom has more electrons, they must be in the third energy level because you cannot hold more than 8. And in this case, we can see here a third. What is the maximum amount of electron you can put in a third electron shell? 8. So for all the energy levels or for all the electron shell, the max amount of electrons, again, that you can put there is 8. So let's account how many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So notice that we have 7. So that means that in theory, we could add an electron shell here, an electron to complete, to make 8, which is the full of an electron shell. And I'll tell you right away now that that is what atoms want in theory. And I'm talking what they want, um, like hypothetically, thinking like they think, uh, because they're trying to complete their valence shell. So, but what the heck is a valence shell? Let's look what is that now. So what the valence shell is not other than the outermost electron shell in an atom. So what that means is, and if you just look at this picture, which I highlighted or color here in red using the same element, the chlorine, is that this is the outermost, in other words, the layer of electrons that are farther away from the nucleus. And this is important because you can imagine that, or I'll tell you here, what keeps these electrons closer to the nucleus is by the fact that the nucleus has a positive charge and electrons has a negative charge. So, and I'm going to mention this in just in a minute, but when you have substances or elements or whatever, or atoms that have an electrical charge, charges that are different tends to attract to each other, like almost like magnetism, like they try to get close. And when you have different charges, when you have charge of the same kind, let's say two positive charge or two negative charge, they actually repel each other. So you can imagine that if this attraction exists, The closer the electron to the nucleus, the harder will be, or the most energy will take to take it away, to remove it, to separate it. And the same is true that the the farther away the electron is from the nucleus, the easiest or the less amount of energy will be required to remove it from the nucleus, right? So that's the importance of the valence shell, because when chemical reactions occur or when there's interaction between atoms, what is going to happen is that in certain situations certain atoms will lose electrons from the valence shell, and other atoms will gain or receive electrons for their valence shell. What I mentioned before here is that in theory, and I'm putting this way, atoms try to complete their valence shell to be happy, if you will. So let's read this concept. If the valence shell is full, the atom is stable. In other words, is happy. If the valence shell is not full, the atom is reactive. And we have here two examples of this. This is an stable atom, neon, because what? The valence shell, which is the outermost, is complete. You have 8 electrons. If you need, let's say, and by the way, in this scenario, probably neon will not participate in chemical reactions that much because the valence shell is complete, meaning the neon will not take an electron in a next energy level, because now this will be the new valence shell and it will be incomplete. So in this case, this atom is stable. If we look at the chlorine again, notice that this is a reactive atom because it's missing one electron to complete the valence shell. So this one most likely will participate in chemical reactions. So as a quick recap about what I just mentioned before, just to make sure that you understand this important concept, to understand this interaction or electron behavior, is the fact that the nucleus has a positive charge, right? That in general, the same charges tend to repel each other. So if you have two things that are positive charged, they probably will not like to be together. And if you have things that has a different charges, they're going to attract to each other. They're going to be in a force that will keep those two together. They will attract to each other, right? And then the electrons in the valence shell, as I mentioned before, they're farther away from the nucleus. Therefore, it's easier to either remove or add electrons in a reactive atom. All right, first I want you to pay attention only in this upper portion, right? Only in this part. And by looking at this, we have two different elements. The first one is sodium. Remember sodium, the symbol is Na, and then Sl is the symbol for um, chlorine. So chlorine and sodium. First, let's look at the sodium. How many protons? If you don't have the periodic table, let's just focus on the electrons, right? And primarily, let's focus on the outermost electron shell, which we know now is called the valence shell. So for sodium, notice that sodium has only one electron in the valence shell. And I told you before that atoms, they try to complete their valence shells. So there are two options for the sodium in order to complete the valence shell. One, what do you think is going to be easier? If sodium has only one electron, in order to complete this valence shell, that means that sodium will need how many electrons more? So we said that the maximum is 8, so that means that it will need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We'll need 7 more electrons in order to complete the valence shell. That's not going to be that easy. It's easier for an atom of sodium to give up this only electron and then make this electron shell, the valence shell, and that way this sodium will be full, right? The valence shell will be stable. So in that scenario, sodium, because the way how sodium has these electrons, tends to be an element that will donate an electron. If we compare that with chlorine, we said that chlorine has 7 electrons already in the valence shell. So yes, for chlorine it's easier to receive 1 electron to complete the valence shell than give up all the 7 electrons that are already present. So that's what happens. So when you see B, notice also that once sodium gives up the electron, notice that the symbol of sodium has a positive charge, right? Now it's sodium plus. The reason why is now sodium plus, and just think about it, is because sodium just donate an electron, and the electron has a negative charge. So when you give rid of your negativity, or when you lose negativity, you become more positive. Look what happened with chlorine. When you receive an electron, you're receiving negativity. Therefore, this atom becomes negatively charged, because overall now you're receiving a negative, you're receiving an electron. Now the whole atom has a negative charge. When you donate the electron, you become more positive. Now the whole atom become positive. And then when you have atoms with different electrical charges, one positive and one negative, that is something that attract each other. So in that force of attraction is what form the compound. So you can see here sodium over here and chloride over here. Once they sodium and chloride bind and form this ionic bond, they become sodium chloride, which is the common table salt. Now we're going to focus on these bonds and general concept. I told you before that a bond, we have 3 types, and there's some from those 3, there are bonds that are more strong, and there are some bonds that are weak. So we have weak or strong electrical attraction that holds atom in the same vicinity, right? Or pretty much very close to each other. Um, if we look at this, also the difference between a molecule and a compound is what we can see here. A molecule is when you have 2 or more atoms held together by chemical bonds. Most of the time, these atoms are going to be of the same kind. Like if you look, this molecule of hydrogen or this molecule of oxygen, they're molecules because what you have there is 2 atoms of oxygen right together. Now a compound is made up of 2 or more atoms of different elements, right? So that's why when you see water or CO2, those are compounds because they're not the same element. And you can see here in this how the elements interact to each other and the electrons. So we're going to talk about those in just a minute. From these 3, the most important ones to remember, I would say, are the hydrogen bonds and the ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are very strong, right? So it requires a lot of energy in order, to separate an atom from another that are bound by an ionic bond. Now, hydrogen bonds from these 3, this is the weakest. Okay, so it's easier to break down hydrogen bonds, and this is going to be important as we're going to see, because the DNA of the cells, there are structures in the DNA that what keeps those compounds together are hydrogen bonds, and things that can alter or break these hydrogen bonds can alter the DNA structure. Things like temperature, changes in temperature, or the pH, radiation are things that can break easily hydrogen bonds. Why? Because from this type of bonds, the hydrogens are the ones that are more weak. All right, so we're going to focus first in hydrogen and ionic bonds. Ionic has to do with the name ion, so we're going to learn that first. Then covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds. All right, ionic bonds. So first we need to determine what is an ion. Okay, so an ion is an atom that has an electrical charge. Now, this electrical charge, it could be positive or it could be negative. That doesn't matter. An ion is an element that has an electrical charge. Is an element that is either positive or negative, right? Not a neutral. Now, if it's positive, we call this a cation. If the electrical charge is negative, we call this an anion. So how you're going to remember that cations are positive and anions are negatively charged? My suggestion is to look at the word cation and look at the letter T. All right. To me, that letter T, it kind of looks like a plus sign, and plus means positive. So if that helps, right? Cation has the letter T that looks like a positive. That is a positive charge. And anion is the one that does not have that, right? And there are some examples of that, like sodium, calcium, potassium. So calcium is interesting here, has 2 plus, all right? And hopefully if I have a picture of calcium, I'll show you why calcium has 2 plus instead of just 1 plus like sodium and potassium. And the anions, examples of these is, for example, chloride, right? So when you have elements that has different charges, that's what causes the attraction of many of them, and then this attraction is what forms these bonds. Importantly here is that what when you have elements like sodium and chloride, you have sodium chloride. Uh, this ionic bond can be break by water. All right, so water, which is an important solvent, is able to break down ionic bonds. And just think what happens when you put a table salt in a glass of water, right? The salt eventually will dissolve, and that is because the water is able to break down this bond and separate the sodium from the chloride here. We already mentioned this, so I'm just going to recap these very quickly. Notice that this reaction between sodium and chlorine uh, ended having a process of donation, and so there's a donor and there's a recipient. In this case, the atom that donate electron, as we saw before, was sodium, and the one to receive is or accept the electron is chlorine. So, and then they become positively and negatively charged, and then when you have two ions that have different charge, they attract each other, and that attraction is what keeps those atoms together, forming a compound, in this case, the table salt. Ionic bonds, I told you that from the 3 type of bonds, these are the ones that are the strongest in terms of they're different, they're very hard to break. But the importance of this is that water, which is there are a lot of ionic bonds, and because water has the ability to break down those bonds and separate the atoms from that attraction, or diluting the salt, that's why water is important. It's sometimes known as the universal solvent because it's a compound that is able to break these very strong ionic bonds. And of course, you think about when you put salt, table salt in water, with time they will dissolve. You will not be able to see the salt in the water. Covalent bonds, which is the second one, in this case, the atoms are not donated. The atoms will not donate the electrons. They will share the electrons. Okay, and then based on that, and I have this highlighted for you because that's the key. That if the electrons are shared, then the type of bond that you have is a covalent bond. Now, if when you share the electrons, um, these covalent bonds can be divided into types: non-polar and polar. Okay, so polar means that one side of the compound might have a positive or a negative charge, and a nonpolar, right, will not have a pool of electricity. So all the electrons will be equally shared, and the whole molecule will not have electrical pull. Everything will be equalized, right? So non-electrical pull in the nonpolar, and there's going to be a positive or negative electrical pull in the polar covalent bonds. I'm going to show you this better. It's better to understand this if you see pictures, as you visualize what does that mean. What I have here is our examples of non-polar covalent bonds. For example, these two molecules of hydrogen. Notice that these two are sharing their electrons. So initially what you have is a hydrogen with a single electron, and then you have another hydrogen over here with another single electron. Now remember that the first energy level, in this case if it's hydrogen, this becomes the valence shell. So in order to receive to complete the valence shell, the hydrogen needs to receive one electron, right? And the same thing here with the other one. So the other thing that you might be thinking, well, why this hydrogen do not just donate this, right? Um, Usually, especially remember, the closer an electron is from the nucleus, the harder and the more energy will take to remove that electron from that nucleus. And that's when the covalent bonds take place. When you have elements like this occur, that instead of giving up, donating the electrons, they will share the electrons. So see, when you have this, then this hydrogen, now it has two electrons because it's sharing one, right? So this hydrogen is happy because it has completed the valence shell. The same thing with this other one, because now this hydrogen has one, two. Now this one is happy also because now this one has completed the electron shell. Let's look at this oxygen because it's better if we have more electrons here. So we have the nucleus, which are positively charged, and oxygen has how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so normally oxygen has 8 electrons. And if you look at the valence shell of oxygen, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons in the valence shell. So in order for the oxygen to be happy, it needs to receive 2 electrons. So when 2 oxygen elements get together, they can form a non-polar covalent bond by sharing electrons. So in this way, for example, this oxygen, which this is the amount of electrons that belongs to the oxygen. Now this oxygen will share these 2 electrons, and then that way this oxygen will complete the valence shell. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, plus the 2 that is sharing, so that will be 7, and this will be 8. The same thing for this other oxygen. They're sharing these ones, and that's the way how they complete their valence shell. Also, they're non-polar because there's not a negative pull, there's not an electrical pull. What that means is that if you, for example, if you account the amount of electrons in this side, how many in total? 5. If you account this amount here, how many electrons? 5. If you account here in the center, there's 6. But the point here is that they're more equal. They're like a mirror, right? They're like a mirror image of electrons, and there's not. So the molecule itself is very nicely. There's a nicely distribution of the negative electrons in the whole molecule. This will make more sense when we see polar covalent bond next. All right. right, look with this polar covalent bond, and we're going to use the water, as an example. So what I'm showing you here is the structure of water. So this is the nucleus of the oxygen, and so this is oxygen, and this is hydrogen, right? Remember, the structure of water is H2O, so two hydrogen attached to one oxygen. Oxygen, we said that how many electrons? 6. So oxygen, in order to be happy, wants 2 electrons to complete the valence shell. And hydrogen, we said that hydrogens, they need 1. So when you see how they share the electrons, like this one, let's say that this electron belongs to the hydrogen, and this one really belongs to the oxygen, but now they're sharing it. Hydrogen is happy because it has 2, so the valence shell is complete. Let's say that this electron belongs to the oxygen and this belongs to the hydrogen. Now that they're sharing it, this hydrogen is happy because now the valence shell is complete. And the same thing here. See, this oxygen has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So to complete the valence shell, it will need, more. It will need, well, in this case, the first, I should say this, the first electron shell is complete. So 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 4 plus 5 and 6, the original belongs to the oxygen. Oxygen needs 2 to complete the valence shell. If oxygen shares, or hydrogen share the electron with the oxygen, at the end, oxygen will have a complete valence shell that we can count together, all these yellow ones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. The valence shell is full. But what you need to look at here is the negative. For some reason, oxygen, of course, because it contains more protons, has more positive charge. It kind of pulls all the negative electrons more towards the oxygen itself, meaning that if you look at this side of the molecule, is weakly negative because see all these electrons, and this side of the molecule is weakly positive because you don't have electrons close to that area because they have been pulled by the oxygen. So that's what creates a polar, in which what that means is that this compound, one side of the compound has a weakly negative side, and then you have a weakly positive side. That's all what that means. Lastly, we have the hydrogen bonds. This one is the weakest out of all of them, and is very important because they're specific structures and the cells that are composed by hydrogen bonds, and if they're the weakest, that means that things like temperature, radiation, or pH can break those bonds and can alter the chemical structure of a molecule or of a compound. And we use the example of the DNA. You don't have to memorize anything of this. This is just represent how the DNA is composed, and this one is the chemical structure of a DNA. So in yellow we have thymine, in pink we have adenine, and blue we have guanine, and in green we have cytosine. Later we're going to learn about this, but the point here is that notice these hydrogen bonds that attach and they keep this structure together, right? And notice that they have this dotted line that represent an hydrogen bond, and that represent that it is a weak. If you look at this one, it's a full or a solid line. That means that probably is an ionic bond, right? So the dotted line represents that it's a weak bond, and those are the hydrogen bonds. Are the bonds that are easy to break, and if you break these bonds, that means that this molecule will separate, and then that can break the DNA, and then is when you can have DNA damage in cells that can lead to mutations and cancer, right? Examples of this is, for example, radiation. If you get exposed to sun, right, to the UV light of the sun, your increases of developing skin cancer increases because remember UV light can break these bonds in the DNA of your skin cells, and that can lead to mutation. Then mutations can lead to developing of cancer cells. This other picture just shows proteins, right? Right now, don't worry too much about it. Each letter A, A1, A2, A3, A stands for amino acid. Remember that the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. So when you have a bunch of amino acids linked together, that's what forms a protein. But the point here that I want to make, or just to illustrate, is that you can see again this dotted line that represent a bond. And now that you know if it's that line, that is a hydrogen bond. So proteins are susceptible to misfold because if you break these bonds, the protein will misfold and that can alter the functions and the properties of the protein. Um, Same thing with water, you can look it up there. Let's review some concepts about chemicals reactions now that we know how elements or atoms interact to each other. Before we start talking about the chemical reactions, we need to talk about a little bit about energy and why this energy is important, because I mentioned earlier that the cells in your body, they, in order to be considered alive, they have to have the ability to generate energy, not create energy, but have the ability to obtain energy. And the way how cells obtain energy is when it's through chemical reactions. So in order for us to understand what energy is and how the chemical reaction, how cells will be able to get energy from chemical reactions, we have to learn a few general concepts. This is related to kind of physics, right, in some degree. There are two types of energy: kinetic energy, which is what we call the energy in form of motion, or when matter moves, and potential energy, as the name implies, is the potential of something to generate energy. This illustration makes this concept very clear. So if you see this first portion where you have this big, I guess, block, here this block, it has potential energy. The energy has not been released from this block yet, but of course, if you cut the string here, this block now will be in motion, right? In motion. And now all this potential energy will transform into kinetic energy, which is the energy that can be used to generate a force. And in this case, that force is the one that is going to uh, get against this whatever that is, this pole or whatever, to bring it down. So how we can apply this, but in a chemical reaction? So in humans, the way how this potential energy is stored and then released in a kinetic energy is through something called metabolism. And also this metabolism in humans is the sum of all the chemical reactions. So I mentioned before this molecule called ATP, right? That, and I mentioned this when I was talking about oxygen and how oxygen is important. Now, I'm going to talk about how this is important in more detail at the end of the class, but just know that ATP stands for adenosine 3-phosphate. So adenosine, I have this as an illustration. Let's think about this as a compound of adenosine, and it's called 3 because it has 3 phosphates. These phosphates are attached by a bond, and this bond is the one that contains the potential energy that we mentioned previously. So how you convert this potential energy and useful kinetic energy? The way how that happens in a chemical reaction is if you have a way how you can break this bond, right? When that bond breaks, that releases energy, and that is the energy that the cell will use to do whatever the cell is meant to do. And one of the classic examples that I use is sperm. For example, we know the sperm is the gamete, the male gamete cell, or the one for the reproduction. And we know that the cells, the sperms, are like little worms that has to swim. They have a tail, and that tail has to be the ability to move very quickly in order to swim and reach the ovaries. Well, what powers the energy to move the tail is ATP, is the molecule ATP, and the cell has the ability to break down molecules of ATP, and the energy that is released by breaking those bonds is the energy that powers the movement of the tail. Other characteristics of the chemical reactions is that when you have a compound or atoms interacting to each other, you have what we call a reactant and we have a product. So reactants are basically what you have first, and then a product is what comes from the interaction of the reactants, as you can see here in this picture. We have first nitrogen, and we have also hydrogen. We have 3 hydrogen atoms. When they react each other, they will form a product, and you can see that they have been fused, right? This is what we call a synthesis reaction, in which you start uh, from small and you create something that is big, okay, a bigger. That is that type of reaction. Now, decomposition reactions are those that are is exactly the opposite of synthesis. Here, you start with something big that is already uh, complex, and what happens then the decomposition is that you break that down and you fragment that in something that is small. Those are decomposition. This is just an illustration, right, to explain synthesis reaction, decomposition reaction, and exchange reaction. With letters, right, you just occurs the same with chemicals. So you have note, or let's say this is a chemical, or this is an atom A, and this is an atom B, book, right? The synthesis reaction is to put A and B together, to fuse it, and then forms the word notebook, right? Or we can call this AB, as we look at the example before. Decomposition reaction is the opposite. You start with a word like bookworm, and decomposition, as the name implies, decompose or break down the word in book and worm, right? Or if we think about bookworm being like AB, book will be A and worm will be B, so it will separate them. And the exchange reaction, as you can see, or is illustrated here, is when you, instead of breaking down, you just exchange between one word and another. Okay, moving on. What are the factors that can affect how fast the chemical reaction will take place, or the rate of the chemical reactions? In physics, and there are many things that can increase the velocity how a chemical reaction will occur. For the human body, I would say that the most important that you need to remember are these ones: a catalyst. And specifically, the most important catalysts in the human body are enzymes. So what is the importance of enzymes? Are these things that we have, that our body creates or synthesizes. Many of the enzymes are proteins, and that's one of the reasons why proteins are so important for the human body, is because an enzyme is a type of protein that will increase the velocity how chemical reaction will take place within the cell. And I'm not going to get in details about this right now, but I will give you an example of this. So just keep this on the top of on the back of your head. How, for example, in situations in which we need enzymes to break down molecules, or otherwise we will not be able to break those molecules down to the smallest, is when we talk about carbohydrates. So in the very last portion of the class, we're going to talk about organic compounds, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. And when we talk about carbohydrates, I'm going to mention, or I'm going to remind you about the importance of these enzymes in that process. All right, now we're going to focus on inorganic compounds. Remember inorganic compounds, and remember organic compounds. What was the main difference? What's the requirement? By far, the most important thing to know here in the inorganic compounds are the concepts that we're going to mention here: the pH, acid, base, and buffers. Okay, we already mentioned this. Inorganic compound is the one that do not have both carbon or hydrogen. Organic compound is the substance that has or contains both in the chemical structure, carbon and hydrogen. The first inorganic compound that we're going to talk about is water. Okay, remember what is inorganic because it's missing the carbon. Important here to just read that 70% of the adult's body weight is water, and remember that water is this chemical that is able to break down ionic bonds and also polar covalent uh, compounds. When you have a substance that will dissolve in water, we call the substance hydrophilic. So hydro means water and philic means affinity, if you will. Those are substances that in simple words means that the substance is water soluble or loves water. It's a substance. If a substance do not dissolve with water, we call that hydrophobic. Phobic means fear or that it repels water, right? Examples of hydrophobic substances, this is the one that will be easy for you to memorize, fat, right? Just think about water and oil. When you put water and oil in a container, they don't mix each other very well. Is because oil or fat is a hydrophobic substance. Now, things are hydrophilic. There's also some examples of these, carbohydrates or sugars. Just think about what happens when you put sugar in water, or when you have like salt, like um, um, sodium chloride, right? The table salt. Those are things and that they dissolve in water. Therefore, those are hydrophilic. Water is very important for the human body. These are some of the roles and functions associated with water. Lubricant and cushioning. Just think about your joints, right? The joints, the reason why when you walk and jump, it doesn't hurt is because the joint has something called synovial fluid, and that synovial fluid contains a lot of water. Okay, the synovial joints are joints in your body that contain synovial fluid, and that fluid reduces friction and work as a cushioning also for the joints. Water also has an important role for heat and these other ones that you can read here. Important also water uh, as a media for chemical reactions and the reactions of decomposition, what we call dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis. In this case, in this synthesis reaction, we have, for example, this monomer. It just means that it's a chemical, right? So we have this one that is separated, and you have two substances. If you put those two substances and apply heat or you have a way how to dehydrate, that means that this specific hydrogen from the monomer 2 and this hydroxyl group from number 1, they will separate and they will form H2. Then these monomers will form a synthesis reaction. Remember, synthesis reaction is when you have two different things and then they will fuse. So the chemical reaction will take place, and that means that you will have now a product and you will have water. Okay, water because this H2O came from here. All right, and the reaction that is the opposite, hydrolysis. Hydro always refers to water, and lysis refers to breaking down. So we have a product here, right? And if you add water, right, to that reactant, that can then separate and cause hydrolysis and will cause this separation of these monomers. We already mentioned a little bit about the ionic bonds and salts. The only thing that I'm going to tell you one more time here is that water is considered the solvent, the universal solvent, once again because it is able to dissolve and break down ionic bonds. Once water breaks down ionic bonds, they receive the name of salts. So salts are substances that are binded by ionic bonds, and when they're getting contact with water, they will dissolve and they will separate and will be separated by that. Right. If you're gonna learn something from this class that is important for the real life situation, is gonna be this. It's gonna be the acid base. So this is extremely important for you to know. Okay. I'm not saying that the rest is not important. It is a little bit, but once again, for your basic understanding, these things that I'm encircling here, those are the most important ones. So pH is crucial for you to understand the pH scale, what is a base, what is an acid. Let's look at it.